So welcome everybody. That's our fourth episode of our digital discussion series on Syria. And in the last sessions, we talked about the Assad regime, the inner logics of the war in Syria, the role of external powers, and the humanitarian crisis in Syria. And today we would like to focus more closely on Europe's role in the Syrian war. And therefore we have three wonderful experts with us today, coming from Paris, London, and Berlin. So we have a, so to speak, E3 perspective on Syria. And at least in my view, it's the upper right window. You can see Lina Khatib. She leads the Middle East and North African program of the Chatham House. And before she joined the Chatham House, she was with Carnegie Middle East Center and was their head of the Beirut office. And she was also with Stanford University and the program on Arab reform and democracy there. So in her research, she focused on international relations of the Middle East, Islamic groups and security and political transition. And she has a special focus on the Syrian conflict. So, and she published widely about it and it's often in the international media. So thanks for coming, Lina. And on the left lower window, at least in my view, you see Muriel Asseburg. She is a senior fellow at the Middle East and African division of the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik. SWP, that's the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin. She is focusing in her research on conflict dynamics and peacemaking in the Levante, so Israel, Palestine, Syria in particular. And she has also a focus on German, European, and US Middle East policy. She is, apart from being with the SWP, she is also a member of the scientific committee at the European Universities Middle East program, and also part of the International Advisory Board of the Mediterranean Politics, and also at the advisory board of the PhD program of the Zeit Foundation, which has a PhD program on social change and humanitarian social science. So thanks for coming, Ms. Asseburg. And then we have Salam Kawakibi. He is from Paris. He's there the director of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies in Paris. He is by training a political scientist and an international relation researcher. He holds also a professorship at the master program on development, immigration and crisis at the Sorbonne University. Before that, he was at the Arab Reform Initiative. He was also in Amsterdam before that. And 2006, he was the director of the Institut Français du Proche-Orient in Aleppo. So 3 perspectives from Paris, from London, and from Berlin. If you have missed the other episodes so far, my name is Thomas Müller-Färber. I'm the head of the international program of the Protestant Academy in Locum. And it's a pleasure for me not only to hosting these 3 wonderful experts, but also all the participants out there. Great that you are on board with our discussion. I think more people will log in a minute or so. You have a chance not only to watch and listen to our discussion, but also to participate, of course, by using the Q&A function or the chat function, so both different ways to participate. Q&A is more for us directly, for us panelists. With the chat function, you have the opportunity to write so that everybody can see your questions. We will now have a moderated discussion of about 40 to 30 minutes, and then we will have still time for Q&A. So that's your part of the participants. So without further ado, I would say we will start. I talked far too long already. So maybe we go kick off with an introduction. And I would like to ask you first, Ms. Asseburg, if you can give us a brief overview on the main characteristics of Europe's engagement in the Syrian war. that would be great. So a few points. So please, you have the word.
Sure. I'd say something on European objectives, on the main instruments, and then the impact or lack of impact that the Europeans have had on the conflict dynamics in Syria. So when we look at the objectives, it's already obvious that they have changed. When you look at the beginning, it was clear Europeans said Assad must go, he has lost all his legitimacy. And then after the Russian intervention in the war, Europeans shifted, and now it's the main objective that the Europeans formulate, at least in rhetoric, is ending the war through an inclusive political transition and a negotiated conflict settlement. What are the instruments that the Europeans have used to pursue their objectives? Very early in the conflict, some member states have given limited report to some rebel formations, mainly non-lethal support. We have not seen any military engagement of the Europeans in the conflict that is worth speaking of. Very, very limited only. And the military engagement that we have seen is mostly in the frame of the coalition against the so-called Islamic State. Now, definitely what we have not seen is any kind of military intervention in favor of or so as to protect the civilian population, for example, by imposing a no-fly zone. And there was basically just this limited and one-off airstrike of the coalition of the US, the UK, and France after the use of chemical weapons in Douma in April 2018. So this is one element, the limited military engagement. And that, of course, has led to a situation where Europeans don't have a presence on the ground, don't have a zone of influence on the ground, don't control military dynamics on the ground or influence military dynamics on the ground. Another instrument that Europeans have used is support for the opposition. Again, we see a shift here, starting out with capacity building for the Syrian interim government and opposition formations, stabilization support in rebel-held areas. But today what we mainly see is humanitarian support, humanitarian aid, with the EU and its member states being the largest donors in this field for Syrians in Syria and the surrounding countries. And when you look at this humanitarian support, it's also important to see that it's basically all emergency relief. So it's not building something, it's just trying to prevent the situation from deteriorating even further, living conditions from deteriorating even further. And then the last element I think that is important to see at this point of time is the sanctions, a very comprehensive set of personal and sectoral sanctions imposed on individuals in Syria that are responsible for repression and the use of internationally banned weapons on the one hand, but also on Syrian state institutions. When we look at the impact, it's very obvious to see that the EU and its member states have next to no influence on conflict dynamics, on the behavior of the Assad regime. What they are doing is supporting other actors mainly, like the UN Special Envoy in Geneva and its activities, the Geneva activities, and they're treating the symptoms of the crisis rather than engaging in trying to change dynamics of the crisis. So humanitarian aid, as I said, in Syria and neighboring states, and being a safe haven for at least some of the Syrian refugees.
Touched already on the leverages which Europe has or not has. I will later on like to go to that more deeply. And you also touched about some maybe the mistakes Europe made. Maybe I would like to ask Salam, could you maybe elaborate, or what's your take? What were the major mistakes Europe made so far in the Syrian war, and is there a chance to avoid these mistakes in the future?
Thank you, Thomas. I think first they committed many mistakes. First of them, they didn't have any common politic. You can talk about 27 foreign policy in Europe and not about a European policy concerning the Syrian issue. At least when you see the list of sanctions and you recognize that the half of European countries don't respect the sanctions imposed by the European Commission, you can understand what I mean about the lack of common policy. You have all the Central Europe and Eastern Europe countries who keep their relation, and sometimes more than relation, as Bulgaria, as Romania. It's more mafiosi relation also between the apparatchik, between their country and the Syrian regime. You have also in 2018, the head of the security of Syria was invited to Rome. His name is on top of the sanctions as war criminal. It's only the sanction part of the question. And also, as I said, the question of instrument to apply their policy. They have good discourse, that they have good declaration without any instrument to putting in application. They continue to give Syrians a nice word, nice support, some meeting in Brussels, some meeting in Paris, a friend of Syrian people, but for example, France never give the Syrian opposition any representative recognition of their representative in Paris, for example. The Syrian embassy continue to work as if only the ambassador was asked to be out, but she stay in Paris because she is also in the UNESCO. It's funny, like how they manage their issues. Europe also, when they can work in diplomacy, they didn't do with Iran, with Russia, and also with some Arab countries. They criticize the Syrian opposition as divided Syrian opposition, but also the European country contribute on this division, because you can recognize the Syrian opposition, some groups next or close to Paris, some other close to London, some other also close to Washington, and they prefer to have their own opposition inside the opposition. After that, they come and they talk about the division of the opposition. I think Europe, in the humanitarian issue, it was a reacting policy, not a constructive policy. They pay a lot. Each time I discuss with people from Brussels, they show me figures, and when we know the reality on the ground, we know that those figures are very exaggerated. I don't want to go to mathematical issues. Those figures is not the real money or the real help who go to the field. It's through many bureaucratic and complicated structure, and a huge percentage go to cover all those costs. I think also the privileged relation some European countries have with some Gulf countries like Emirati and France. In my personal point of view, especially Emirate and Saudi Arabia play a very negative role in the development of the Syrian revolution, and they push the Syrians to to go to the militarization and to the radicalization of their sites. And now they led the counter-revolution, as they do in Libya, in Egypt. They support the former regime to come back to control the situation. And I think they think about the same scenario for Syria. I hope I make a mistake in this analysis, but I feel that coming soon.
See. Okay, many thanks. I think your connection was not that perfect. Somehow, I don't know if it's only me or yeah. We will try later on. I think Salam, it was a bit cracky, but we will try next time. I think it's better maybe then we switch off the thing here. And many thanks. You touched a bit on already on these different perspectives and fault lines within European countries on Syria. Lina, I would like to ask you if you can elaborate more on the so to speak, internal architecture of Europe's Syria policies. Where are the major fault lines between the European countries on that? Or where are major fault lines emerging now? And where's the zones of mutual agreement? Can you maybe give us some ideas about that? That would be great.
Okay, thank you very much. When it comes to fault lines, as Salam highlighted, there are a number of countries in Europe that seem to favor just basically getting on with it as far as they see it. Countries that basically have now decided that the Assad regime is here to stay, so we might as well focus on stabilization and perhaps even reconstruction, as opposed to think about regime change, because that's just not realistic. So they are painting their continued engagement one way or another with the Assad regime through, for example, keeping embassies open in Damascus, or as Sanam pointed out, sometimes hosting officials from the Assad regime in Europe. They see this as pragmatism and realpolitik. You have this kind of activity going on that goes completely against the European Union's own stated policy, which is that no money is to flow into Syria for reconstruction without there being a political process as per the UN Resolution 2254. So in a way, the fault lines are between the EU as an institution and some of its member states. But also, among member states, we are seeing diversions. And here, there are some countries that always kept lines of communication open with the Assad regime, and others that completely withdrew, and others that, as Salam highlighted, have kind of tried to play it both ways, like France. France having been quite vocal in saying we support the opposition, but at the same time, Salam kind of, I think, painted a very complete picture there. So you have that, and then you have countries like my own, which is the United Kingdom, a country that had distinguished itself very early on by actually going as far as give military assistance in the form of training and some military equipment to Syrian rebels who at the time were known as the Free Syrian Army, but at the same time not doing this at a level that is high enough to create a change in the game when it comes to the conflict. And even before that, we did not see engagement by the UK diplomatically that could have prevented the crisis in Syria from transforming into a conflict in the first place. And in all this, the UK has basically been following the United States. So in a way, how I would describe it is UK policy on Syria is not an independent UK policy. It is very much a component of US policy. And with the US having changed its mind about arming the opposition, having closed down the coordination centers, having largely, I would say, given up even on the political process, the UK has simply followed suit. And I think with Brexit now being in place, unfortunately, I don't see this dynamic being reversed. So while, as we heard, Europe in general is rather lacking in coherence when it comes to its approach to the Syrian crisis, the UK is going to make the situation worse because Brexit means that the UK will be under increasing influence, in my view, when it comes to Washington's foreign policy interests. And here, if we think about what Washington is doing right now, the approach to Syria is very much part of the larger approach to Iran. So in a way, there is no distinct US foreign policy on Syria, as far as I can see. It's just a subcomponent of the maximum pressure strategy that the US is taking towards Iran. And in a way, right now, the United States is no longer talking about regime change in Syria. It is also saying it doesn't really matter if the Russians are influential in Syria or not, because ultimately the US is rather enjoying a quagmire for Russia scenario to happen in the long run, and also looking at its maximum pressure strategy on Iran as being successful. And we know that all this is also coupled with pressure from the United States on Europe to comply with its maximum pressure strategy on Iran. And as I said, with Brexit happening, with Europe being not very coherent anyway, this makes it less likely that Europe is going to strike out its own independent path, its own approach to Syria that is distinct from this US line. So unfortunately, I don't see much that is positive when it comes to Europe's ability to formulate a coherent and viable strategy towards the Syrian conflict.
I see. Okay. Maybe you have elaborated on that already a bit, but I would like to ask Salam maybe to bring a bit more clear what are currently the goals and interests of Europe. Is it possible to say that there are any goals or interests, or is it what can Europe in the current situation at all achieve? And can you maybe say some words about that?
I hope now my voice is more
it's better.
I think as I said first, we don't have a Europe goals or Europe common objective. I think for the main country like Germany, France, and perhaps Italy and Spain, the main issue is the stability. The main issue is counter-terrorism. The main issue is to stop the migration. And all the question of democracy, of human rights, it's marginalized, and they create the European Endowment for Democracy to be in charge of this issue. And the diplomacy of Brussels, diplomatical work of Brussels, it's now against the Arab Spring. When we discuss with people, they found in General Sisi a very good example of stability, of security, and of anti-terrorism policy. And we know what they do in Libya, what they do also in Iraq and in Syria. Now, I think the issue, the goal was changed after the creation of Islamic State, and it was objective alliance between the regime in Syria and the ISIS to convince Europeans to forget all the principles and the values of political transition. As Muriel said, the realpolitik now it's very hegemonic in the thought of European diplomat. For example, in France, Emmanuel Macron said very clearly, Assad, it's the enemy of his people. I am concerned by the ISIS. I'm not concerned by Assad. His problem is with his people. it's not my problem. Of course, it's a new vision of international relation, and it's a very, we feel the domination of what I call Übervedrine diplomacy, that human rights don't have anything to do with foreign policy, that the value don't have any to do with country interest, especially with, it's very important to say, this vision of Europe, this new vision of Europe, new old vision of Europe to the South, country in the South, it's very culturalist, very Orientalist in the negative way of the Orientalism. Those people don't deserve democracy. Those people don't have any intellectual capacity or really well to be Democrat. Then we can be more safe if we work with their what they call just despot or despot éclairé ou despot juste.
Now your voice was far better. So really thank you very much. And of course, I forgot to say, when I asked one of you, the others of course have always chance to participate and add something if you want to. Is there something now you want to add to Salam's, or shall we go on with other questions? Go on with other questions. Okay. Now, because Ms. Azerburg, you already mentioned these different leverages or not so leverage tools Europe has, I would like to dive more into that, and I would like at first to talk about sanctions, because that came a bit re-emerged again with the CISA Act, I think, which is now very vivid discussed in the US and maybe also in Europe, the new sanction package by the US Congress. So maybe I ask you, Lina, how effective were the European sanctions, and should they be tweaked in the future? Or does it make sense at all to tweak them? Because people say, well, it's not really working. Shall we skip them at all? So what's your take on sanctions? And please, the others, join in if you want to. Lina, please, you go first.
Thanks. I mean, definitely we should continue with the sanctions and not do away with the sanctions. I think the problem with the sanctions is not the sanctions, is that sanctions are only one part of the story. You cannot expect to have a game-changing result in the Syrian conflict just with sanctions alone being imposed. I mean, at the moment, when it comes to EU sanctions, 70 different Syrian entities fall under these sanctions, 273 people. We can very safely expect that, say, in a few weeks' time, the number might grow just because the Assad regime keeps getting more and more people on board to do its business with external actors as a way to circumvent the sanctions. So the regime is always trying. Does that mean the sanctions don't work and we should quit? Definitely not. The issue, if anything, that the sanctions need to be more comprehensive. And I am supportive of the Caesar Act because it does that, because it's not just about sanctioning Syrians who are involved with the Assad regime. The Caesar Act is about sanctioning anyone who is doing business with the Syrian regime and its entities. And that is important because then foreign entities can fall under these expanded sanctions. And this is already having an impact inside Syria. For example, right now, the regime is preparing for elections inside Syria. It is interesting to track who is running for office in Syria, knowing that, of course, the elections are neither fair nor transparent and definitely not representative. But even then, some of the traditional cronies are beginning to think again because of the imposition of the Caesar Act. So the sanctions are having an impact at some level, but it's not enough. What we really need is for the UN process to be effective, and sadly it is not. If anything, I would blame the UN more than the EU, when it comes to, or Europe at large, when it comes to the situation that we are in, because the UN peace process has largely been cosmetic. But on top of that, and I have been saying this for lots of years now, and I will say it again, I don't think, sadly, it is the EU or the UN or any such international organization that is going to push the Syrian conflict towards a resolution. You need political will in Washington, and sadly, that has been lacking. Without that, we're only dealing with symptoms of the problem, not the real problem. No one, especially Russia, is going to take any peace process seriously unless there is serious American pressure. And sadly, as I was saying in my earlier comments, unfortunately, right now, the US is saying behind closed doors, we don't really mind if Russia runs the show in Syria because this doesn't conflict with our interests. Our problem is mainly Iran. And therefore, again, here we have it, a situation in which sanctions can only deal with the symptoms of the injury and not the real cause.
Okay. Ms. Azebuk, you want to join in, please?
Yes, I think I have a slightly different take on the sanctions issues. And that has to do with, I think it makes sense to look at the different kinds of sanctions that we have. And I agree with everything you said, Lina, when it comes to the individual sanctions. And also the sanctions that have to do with the embargo, like the arms embargo, the oil embargo, things like that, repressive capacities, dual use. I'm on board with that. I still think that Europeans should revisit their sanctions and have a closer look at some of the other sanctions. Now, one is clarifying humanitarian exemptions and making sure that there is no overcompliance, for example, by banks when it comes to the sanctions. Now, this is something that I hear from Syrians time and again, that the overcompliance that takes place by banks is a problem for them because it makes it impossible for them to get money transfers. Now, of course, this is again complicated even more by the measures that the government of Syria has taken on the banking sector. But overcompliance is a problem. And then there is the question of humanitarian exemptions from CISA sanctions for non-US entities. That is something that Europeans should be speaking about with the Americans. And especially in view of the situation that we're currently witnessing in Syria, the dramatic situation of deterioration of living conditions, the currency meltdown, the erosion of public services, fragmentation. And I think it is really of utmost importance that now we do not just drive this further and further without distinguishing between the different kinds of sanctions that are in place. Last but not least, the sanctions that prevent the rehabilitation of basic infrastructure and services on the local level, I think those need to be revisited too. And that goes, when you look at European sanctions, that has to do, of course, with the question of electricity, for example, but also the European Investment Bank not being able to invest in Syria in anything that would benefit the state. And I find that quite problematic, the way this is formulated. If you formulate that in a way that is linked to individuals that are responsible for war crimes, grave human rights violations, I'm fine with that. But the state as such, of course, that is a bit tricky. So I think, yes, there needs to be a revisiting of the sanction system and distinguishing more clearly between different kinds of sanctions and taking into account the impact that the sanctions have on the civilian population in Syria.
Okay, Salam, you please,
yeah.
and then maybe Lina, you can respond.
Yeah, I think Muriel, when you make distinction between state and personality in Syria, it's very European because we cannot make this distinction between state because we don't call it state in Syria, we call it regime. and the person on the head of this regime. But in the same time, I share your scare from the sanctions, because especially Caesar law, it's something very large, and the regime, as he have a good advisor from Russia and from Iran, he can manage the impact, direct impact in him about those sanctions, but he will reflect the impact, real impact on the population, and saying, you see what the Western do for you, you see what those democracy do for you, and in the end of the day, the sanction will be, perhaps, I am very scared for that, will be helpful for the regime, especially when we know that in the contemporary history, any sanctions wasn't effective, and except South Africa, and the circumstances was different, very different, to be compared with Syria. But neither on Cuba, North Korea, Iran, Iraq, Libya, the sanctions had a very real impact on the head of the power. And also the regime can put more money in his pocket through the developing of the parallel economy of black market, and they know very well how to do it. They know very well.
Okay, Lina, maybe you continue.
Yeah, just wanted to echo what Salam said about the state and the regime. I mean, in an ideal scenario, you would have state institutions that are separate from the regime that rules them. But in Syria, what the ruling regime of Bashar al-Assad is doing, it's try to have complete control over state institutions and force any external organizations that want to do any humanitarian work in Syria to have to go through state channels, because this is a way for the regime to get its hands on this aid. So while I agree with humanitarian exemptions, I don't think this means channeling them or any aid through state institutions in Syria. There are other channels that could be used. Perhaps smaller, more informal, community-based initiatives is the way to go. Ultimately, yes, they may be small, but the cumulative effect will be significant. But we shouldn't play into the hands of the regime by thinking there is a distinction right now between state power and regime power, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe we move to another leverage question mark, which is also hotly debated at the moment. That's the question of reconstruction. And Asselburg, you wrote recently a paper, which is publicly available on the SWP website, about reconstruction, and made some thought about it. Maybe you elaborate a bit on this reconstruction aid, whether one should engage in that or not?
Yeah, sure. To make it clear from the beginning, I don't think Europeans should engage in reconstruction now. And I echo the thinking that is there in the European institutions and some of the big member states, that engaging in reconstruction at this point of time would only contribute to shoring up, to supporting a repressive regime, cementing conflict lines, and it would sow the seeds for confrontation in the future, especially because of the way that Damascus is pursuing its own reconstruction agenda. That is very much to the detriment of certain population groups and trying to buy the loyalty of others and compensate its external backers. I would still say that the way the Europeans have been dealing and have been trying to achieve their aims in Syria has been very ineffective. Now, I don't see that they have a lot of leverage, but I think they should try to be more effective in the way that aid is dispersed and go a bit beyond what they have been doing so far. One is a point that Lina has already spoken about, the way that humanitarian aid in those areas that the regime controls is being manipulated and being politicized. And the Europeans, as the biggest donors of humanitarian aid, haven't really engaged in trying to prevent that politicization. So they claim when they give humanitarian aid, rather than engaging in development, that this is neutral or it doesn't support the regime. In fact, most of the aid is channeled in a way that the regime uses it for its own purposes. And that's a point that Europeans should actually put a lot of emphasis on. They have made some attempts doing this. There is something called a joint program mechanism where they try to work with a number of UN agencies and commit them to certain standards, so that aid is dispersed according to humanitarian standards of need and doesn't run counter, for example, to housing, land, and property rights. Very difficult because the UN organizations that work in Syria are so penetrated by regime people, and because these organizations have to negotiate basically every step they make with Damascus. But Europeans should put more emphasis on trying to see to it that humanitarian aid is really dispersed based on humanitarian standards. The second thing is that I think some EU countries have moved beyond pure emergency relief, and that others should follow that and move towards rehabilitating basic infrastructure. Now, if it's possible to do that without any contact to the state, I'm not sure at all. And I understand what both of you, Salam and Lina, have been saying, that it's very difficult to dissect the state and the regime. Of course, the regime has captured all state institutions and they cannot be dissected like this. Still, for the rehabilitation of basic infrastructure, when you're speaking schools, clinics, water, electricity, waste, you will have to engage with the state institutions, at least on the local level. And I think that is something that is very difficult to circumvent. And I fear it's not possible to do that only through community engagement. Now, the EU is channeling some money to civil society organizations in this area. I don't think that you can do that fast enough and comprehensively enough to really address the needs that are there on the local level today. And I think that kind of engagement is crucial now. What I also think would be useful, and that points more towards the long term, is that Europeans have another look at their, what they call the more for more approach. That is a roadmap, if you wish, on what they expect from Damascus in terms of steps that they would reciprocate with closer cooperation, leading in the end to European engagement in reconstruction. I find it important in that context to make it very clear that I'm not speaking about normalization with the top of the regime. I don't think that should be in the cards now in the midterm and even in the long term, but rather what I want to see there is that the Europeans not only continue what they have been doing, that is supporting documentation by Syrian NGOs, international NGOs, by international mechanisms like the IIIM, of war crimes, of human rights violations, of illegal use of weapons, but also that they move ahead with encouraging prosecutions in national courts in those European countries where that is possible under the principle of universal jurisdiction. It's not only that it has to be possible, it's also that the respective countries or the states have to make the resources available so that the law enforcement agencies actually can take that on and will take it on. So it's also a question of resources and of political climate that makes sure that this is actually what we want to do. We want to engage in prosecution of crimes so as to be able to provide a basis later for reconciliation of sorts, but also to deter finally others from engaging in these kind of activities.
Does someone of you want to join in, or shall we continue? Yeah, Salam, I saw your hand sign. Yeah, please.
Yeah, as Muriel said about the corruption of United Nations organization, political corruption, at least without talking about other dimension, they, for example, put it the wife of the foreign minister or the vice foreign minister as responsible of the trauma of the children in their agency. It's a very Kafkaian situation. I think the danger that European also go on the same, because the regime can even if we want to rebuild a school, we want to rebuild, it's very important to be engaged in this field. But the dangers, it's very high, and the manipulation, it's very, the regime know very well how to do it. If Europe have the instrument to control, to be more strong and less corrupted politically than the United Nations, why not? But I am afraid that it's not possible without all the manipulation, without all the what I call the first lady non-governmental organization. The regime, he built a new civil society called Gongos, or First Lady Non-Governmental Organization. And for the European, in the year of since 2000 till 2010, they consider it like a real civil society. It was Gongos.
May I just add something there to what Salam said. One thing that European member states can possibly do is try to exert pressure through the UN on UN agencies that are working right now in Syria that are part of the problem. Because we have had the UNDP, for example, and others, unfortunately, support projects in Syria through state institutions, just because that's how the UN works. But more than that, allowing sometimes the Syrian regime to even select who gets appointed in these UN agencies inside Syria. So the influence of the regime is more than it really needs to be, even by the UN's own justifications of, well, we sometimes have to work with the state. So engagement within the UN system by Europe to make sure that there is conditionality applied and make sure that there is transparency applied in these situations, I think would be very important.
I have one final question before we then should start with the Q&A. Maybe very brief, the thing of protection corridors and no-fly zones, which was highly, very vividly debated in, at least here in Germany at the beginning of the year. Salam, what do you think? Is this still an option, or is it completely off the table? Anything protection?
Too late, after 500,000 of victims, without any initiative, without any engagement to protect the civilian people, I think it's too late. And now, in this time, it was only the regime who bombarded his population. Now you have more than 9 foreign army who bombard Syria, and it's very complicated to put it on the table now.
Okay, with that, I think we should, because we are running a bit out of time, start with a discussion, and the participants are already sending around a lot of questions. Maybe we start with one question. I think everyone can read it. If not sanction, what else can be applied? That was something Khaled wrote in his in the chat. Maybe I think it goes to you, Lina. If sanctions not working, if reconstruction is difficult, is there anything? And we learned no-fly zones also not an option. Shall we do? What shall we do after all? Please.
Well, I think I've outlined some of the things that can be done, such as exerting some pressure within the UN system would go a long way towards not playing into the Assad regime's hands. I would add to that empowering civil society, very important, as Salam highlighted, not to be duped by this official regime-sanctioned civil society that is now kind of at play in regime-controlled areas in Syria. And to recognize that even in these areas, there are still genuine grassroots movements. Sometimes European donors, especially, think that these initiatives are too small. They don't have the capacity as European donors to deal with them. But perhaps it could be a two-tier system, to have institutions that are perhaps operating from outside Syria be working directly with the donors, and for these institutions to be working directly with these smaller initiatives inside Syria. That can work as a model that wouldn't overwhelm the European donors, but allow them to channel the funding to the people that need it the most. So we need to be creative in the way we, in Europe, deal with the situation on the ground. But as I said, sanctions are not a failure. It's just that they alone can't do much. So we shouldn't put all our eggs in the sanctions basket.
Then I have a question which also touches on the sanction, which came from Mr. Leonard, who asked, what are the negative consequences of the Caesar Act? Isn't it affecting negatively the population? Maybe one of you can answer that. Who wants to take this? Salam, please.
First, the population are really affected since 1970, and recently since 2010. The most main cities are destroyed by the airplanes, by the TNT barrels. We have torture industry in Syria, very developed. And I think the sanction will add some sufferance, as I said in my intervention, especially that the regime who know how to manage. And in the end of the day, if the regime the sanctions are not really targeted and applied, I think it will be prolongation of sufferance of Syrian people. Not to create a new sufferance, but it's a prolongation.
And then we have a question by Rainer Lucht, who asked, who would like to learn more about what role the Syrian opposition plays in the European politics towards Syria. I think Salami already mentioned that everyone has its own opposition, but maybe some of you can elaborate more on that. Who wants to take this? Lina, Salam, or Salam? You raised your hand.
I think the international community, they create something to occupy the opposition, what I call the Geneva Commission of Constitution. It's as you have in the problem of Corona-19, your children who make a very noise, You put them in the garden with some play to be away and to do something away of your room, your office. For me, the mission of Mr. Pedersen, it's exactly that. Because now all the opposition are engaged in the process of to discuss a new constitution. And if we know the Syrian constitution, it's not the problem in the Syrian constitution. The Syrian constitution is not more bad than the French constitution. But the Syrian constitution was never applied since 1963. It's the problem. It's the despotism regime who refused to apply his own constitution. That now the opposition are occupied by this stuff, and they are very divided. They don't have any support, real support. They have only this coin to play in the garden.
Okay. Okay, I see. Someone want to add of you, or shall we continue? Continue. Maybe there's an interesting question which asks for the perspective that the Syrian regime has on the EU. Is there does it maybe play no role for Damascus, Europe? What we can only ponder about it, but what does Assad think about Brussels and the European countries? Who wants to take this? Yeah, Ms. Asabo, please.
I can't, of course, look into the head of the of Bashar al-Assad, but I can see and read and hear what he says. And I think it was very interesting to see over the last few years that it was the Russians that wanted the Europeans to engage in reconstruction, not Assad and his cronies. So it was very clear, he made it very clear, and he wants support from those who stood by his side all through the conflict. And he doesn't want the Europeans to engage and impose any kind of conditionality. So he doesn't see Europe as an ally, and he doesn't see it as friendly. Of course, still, people in the regime can distinguish very well between different kinds of Europeans, and they know exactly who has stayed on their side, who has engaged all through, for example, in the area of intelligence cooperation, what the discussions are in member states. When you look at Germany, for example, we had now the second delegation from our parliament visiting there and late last year. And of course, they are very welcome in the Syrian parliament and are received with lots of honors by all kinds of figures from the regime. So there is an interest in playing on these divisions and on the dividing lines and increasing them, and in making sure that there is no strong European policies, and that Europeans lose the little leverage they can have when they act together. Because if they're divided, they don't have any leverage on Damascus.
Okay, I see. Okay, interesting. I have another question that came in not through the chat, but through the Q&A. And a person asked about military intervention. Why did the Europeans accept and supported silently the US strategy, which supported heavily Islamist and radical militias with arms and trainings to topple the Assad regime, and how Europe see now the result of this strategy? That's a question we often get. Elaborate on that. Salam, please.
I don't think the United States and the European support radical groups in Syria. When they support, and they support very selectively, they support non-radical group rebels. But when they let them away, let them alone, of course, the radicalization of the rebels become a process, very normal and very logic process for those who know Syria and who know the engagement of the money and of the foreign radical donors on the ground. But in the beginning, it was not the Western, even the United States, they didn't support radical groups in the ground.
Yeah, I will just add to that to say what I was speaking about in the beginning in terms of support for the Free Syrian Army, eventually stopping the coordination rooms being closed down. A lot of these groups found themselves with a situation in which they needed to get funding from somewhere and equipment from somewhere, and this made them very easy to be targeted by jihadist groups. Of course, the regime always uses this narrative to discredit anything that could be labeled opposition, and it has done this very early on, even before Islamists came into the picture in Syria. And that's one thing that I am always keen to remind people about, that when the revolution in Syria started in 2011, this was not an Islamist jihadist-led movement. It was a genuine grassroots movement for change and reform and rights and dignity. The Islamist element came later, and we shouldn't forget that the Assad regime itself played a huge role in this by releasing Islamists from Saidnaya and other prisons in 2011 in order to tell the world that it wasn't crushing a peaceful uprising or even an armed uprising, but it was actually crushing Islamist terrorists hell-bent on destabilizing Syria. So we have to not forget that the regime contributed to the radicalization. Yes, of course, the external donors, mainly in the Gulf, played a role in this. Yes, of course, we have jihadist groups like Al-Qaeda playing a role in this, but the regime itself also played a huge role in this.
Okay, thank you. There's one question coming from across the Atlantic from the Science Hopkins University. William Zartman is asking, Syria is a Russian protectorate at the moment. How much does the European states desire to mollify Russia accounts for their weak Syrian policy? Maybe Ms. Azebrook, you can take it, or Salam, who wants? Salam raised his hand.
I'd be happy to start, and then
yeah,
Salam
sure.
can chip in. I would contest that Syria is a Russian protectorate. Part of Syria definitely is, the larger part is, but it's not Russia alone. There is, in that same area, we have Iran present, we have Iran-led militias present. Parts of Syria now is occupied by Turkey. And of course, we still have, if a very small, presence of the United States. We have other states who ignore completely the sovereignty of Syria, with Israel bombing the way it wants in Syria. So it's not only one foreign player that is active there and that calls the shots, actually, what is happening in Syria. I think it would be easier for the Europeans to agree on Syria with the Russians in case they hadn't so many other issues with Russia. So it seems to me this is the other way around. The problem is between Europe and Russia on issues that have mainly to do with European territory and EU-Russia relations, and then only secondly with different visions for the future order of Syria. Now, this is probably not satisfactory to Syrians, but I think this is the way Europeans see it, at least.
Okay, Salam, you also wanted to join in?
I think the feeling in Europe, or what they want to believe on to escape from any engagement, that Syria it's under the Russian protectorate. They prefer to say it, even if it's not true, as you said, Muriel. but it's even if they believe on that, it's a room for them to negotiate with Russia, to try to find a solution, median solution about the future of Syria, playing on the reconstruction file, because as Russia asked the European to be engaged, European can show their diplomacy in this issue, to saying yes, but condition, and etc. etc. Now it's this feeling it's coming from Obama administration, because for Obama administration it's very clear Syria, it's Russian influence area. We don't care. We have our ally in the region. If Russia also have their base in the Mediterranean, why not? But now I think it's more complicated, as Muriel said. We have many occupation in Syria. The first one, it's in Damascus.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we take two additional questions and we should slowly wrap up, because I promised you not longer than 1 hour and we already run a bit over the time. I have one person ask a more historic question. Do you think the European countries like France, Great Britain, or even Germany should have given military support to the moderated rebels? Would have that changed anything? Or that's a more historic question, but maybe interesting even. Who wants? Lina, maybe you?
One should never ask such questions. What if, when it comes to, because it really doesn't change anything. I mean, that alone would not have changed much. You have to look at the big picture. The problem with Syria is that there was never a comprehensive strategy taken by the West in general to dealing with this conflict. The strategy, it seems to me, in the beginning was about exerting some pressure on the regime in the rather unrealistic expectation that this would push the regime to come to the table to negotiate. It smacks of a complete misunderstanding of how the regime in Syria works and lack of foresight. No one seemed to see that the Russians and Iranians would come and be engaged, just like no one from the regime and Russia and Iran side seems to have realized that Gulf countries and Gulf individuals would also come and try to support the opposition on the ground that was starting to get armed, for example. So there is no one thing that we could have done that would have completely changed the game in Syria. I think before we talk about support for the moderate rebels, we should roll back and think, could there have been a diplomatic way out from the very beginning? And sadly, even there, we see that the United States under Obama was saying all the right things without doing any of the right things, and that just added to the problem. So there's a lot that in hindsight we could say what if about, but it's not that one magic thing that could have changed the game, unfortunately.
Here's a question, maybe that's the final from the participants. Also, there are more questions out there, but I think we should come to an end because I promised that you have additional appointments during the day. There's one asking, and you already touched on that, that's by Mark, who asked, is there not any more control that the European states could exert in giving their investment or their support, the aid to Syria? You mentioned that there's a possibility to, for example, put more pressure on the UN organizations too. But is there something additional one can do if we have to bear in mind that Europeans pay most, not most, but a large proportion of the aid in Syria? Is there more tweaks one can add to this? Who wants to take Mark's question? Yeah, Ms. Assenburg.
I think this is something that the Europeans could try in trying to set up a larger project in one of the cities with regards to infrastructure rehabilitation. Now, I'm very skeptical that it can actually work, that they will have the leeway, the space to work with the companies that they want to work with, to work in a way that the aid goes to all the population groups, that it connects the different quarters rather than entrenching the divisions between the people. But I think it would be useful trying to move forward on that. I only think it would be useful to try that if Europeans are willing at the same time, once they see it does not work, the money is appropriated, it's again spent in a way that punishes whole population groups, that it's against HLP rights and so on, that in that moment the Europeans stop doing this. And this is, I think, one of the issues why a lot of people are very careful to move in that way, because they think once the Europeans start spending money, then they will not take it back, and they will just close both eyes and let it pass, even though even if we run into the same problems as with the humanitarian aid of that is spent by the United Nations. I think it would be worthwhile trying, but be very aware of what is happening, and the moment you're not allowed to do things accordingly, then to stop immediately.
Now to the wrap up. I always ask the final question for the wrap up. It's the crystal ball question. I know you don't have a crystal ball, I assume, but if you had one and could look into the future, how will the Syrian conflict evolve in the next 2 years? What's your take? Just wild guessing are welcome to that point. Nina, you're nodding your head. Maybe you have a crystal ball. Oh, you don't.
I wish I did, and I wish I had the solution. You said the next 2 years. The Assad regime is planning on staying through claiming that Assad is going to win in the next election, which is next year, actually, 2021. We are seeing the parliamentary elections that are, going to be just a joke, basically happen later in July. But the presidential elections are the main issue, and these are meant to happen next year. And with the US not basically talking about the regime change right now, we can safely expect, unfortunately, Assad to stay in power next year. There is some talk of maybe running another candidate against Assad who would have some sort of support, knowing that candidate will not win, but perhaps that candidate could win, significant enough seats to kind of show that Assad is not anymore elected at 99% or whatever of the vote, just to send a message to Assad. But I think even that is largely cosmetic. Ultimately, for me, it's all about the Russian-US relation, and what happens in the US elections will play a role in this as well. So I don't have a crystal ball, but I can say these are the things to look out for. What will happen with the presidential elections in Syria, what happens with the US domestically, and what happens with the US and Russia.
Okay. Salam, you raised your hand.
Yeah, I am very pessimistic, as usual. My friend know me. I can say that Putin will stay till 2036 first. And nothing push me to think that he will not keep the Assad dynasty till this date. But to be less pessimistic, I think the Russian they will put some cosmetic change in the head of the power, keeping Assad also, or his family, because he have cousins, brothers, and if they can convince Iran to have less influence, with the help of Israel, because we must know that this complicated alliance between Israel and Russia, and it's very amazing issue with Assad also. For the election, yes, this time he will win without 99%. And to laugh a little bit, his father winning election with a percentage of 120%, because the death was voting in this time. Now he will accept 90% or 95%, and it's for some people it will be very good step on the way of democracy in 2 or 3 centuries.
You have the final words, so to speak.
I fear that I'm also going to be pessimistic. I mean, I think when we look at the next 2 years, we will not see any negotiated settlement to the conflict. We won't see any power sharing or political transition. We will not see reconciliation, and we will not see any kind of stabilization. I don't see any agreement between the Astana powers and Damascus on northern Syria. So probably frozen fronts in the north, but with a very high risk of renewed fighting. And then in general, you have the geostrategic contradictions between the external powers present in Syria, between Turkey and the Kurds, between Iran on the one side, Israel and the US on the other, between US and Russia, and that also will all contribute to not having stabilization. We will also not see reconstruction, we will not see economic recovery, we will see a further deterioration of living conditions and suffering of the civilian population. I'm not so sure if that, how stable the regime in the end is. I'm not saying I see regime collapse happening in the next 2 years, but today I wouldn't count it out as much as I would have half a year ago. Even if that were to happen at this point of time, it wouldn't lead me in to rejoicing and being very happy about that in the current situation, because there is nobody, I don't see any force now in Syria that would be able to pick up the pieces and hold the country together and lead it forward to a state that is less depressing than what we are speaking about here.
Well, all of you are rather pessimistic view, but I expected it somehow, of course. Okay, thank you to everybody. There are more questions which we had no time to answer, but I saw Salam is ready to answer them. If you write him, he sent the email to the chat. You see it, participant out there. And thank you to all 3 of you. It was very insightful, and I learned again a lot. And thanks to the participants for your active involvement. And if you want to, we have next week on Wednesday, the last session, our Syrian series, and there we will look into the future and ask about what's the power of the Syrian diaspora. And we will do this together with Basma Kotmani and Christine Hellberg. So welcome to join in this as well. So thanks everybody, and with that, have a good evening and a good night.
Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you.
Bye bye. Bye bye.